In the autumn of 1918, along the Belgian coast, something was happening that made very little sense by any conventional understanding of what a warship was supposed to be or how it was supposed to be used. A vessel of approximately 5,900 tons displacement, drawing only a little over 3 meters of water, was positioned approximately 15 kilometers from the shore, sitting nearly motionless in a shallow coastal sea, while her crew prepared to fire a single gun. The gun was a naval 18-inch Mark I, the largest caliber gun ever mounted on a British warship, firing a projectile that weighed 1,536 kilograms, and that, when it left the barrel at a muzzle velocity of approximately 735 meters per second, carried enough energy to destroy a reinforced concrete fortification, penetrate the equivalent of 600 millimeters of armor plate, or obliterate a railway junction more than 30 kilometers inland. The vessel carrying this gun was HMS Lord Clive. She was not fast. She made approximately 6 knots. She was not maneuverable. She turned with the ponderous reluctance of something that had been designed for stability rather than agility. She was not armored in any conventional sense, her sides being adequate against small arms and shell splinters, but presenting no meaningful resistance to the guns of a modern warship. She could not fight another warship, could not run from one, and could not, in any realistic tactical sense, defend herself against a determined surface attack. She was a floating platform for the gun, and the gun was the entire point of her existence. The specific lineage of ships that produced HMS Lord Clive, and the strategic logic that made building such a vessel rational rather than absurd, begins not in the First World War but in the American Civil War, in the rivers and estuaries of the Confederate States, where an earlier generation of naval officers had confronted a similar problem and had arrived at a similar answer. The original USS Monitor, commissioned in February of 1862, was the vessel that established the type and gave it its name. She was designed by the Swedish-American engineer John Ericsson, built in approximately 100 working days at the Continental Iron Works in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, and commissioned with a deliberate urgency that reflected the crisis created by the Confederacy's ironclad Virginia, which had devastated the wooden Union fleet at the Battle of Hampton Roads on March 8, 1862. The Monitor was not designed to be a general-purpose warship. She was designed to counter a specific threat in a specific operational environment, using a specific tactical concept. Her famous revolving turret, housing 2 11-inch Dahlgren guns, sat on a hull so low in the water that her deck was barely above the surface, giving enemy gunners almost nothing to aim at while allowing her own guns to engage from any direction without the ship needing to maneuver. She was slow, uncomfortable, and in open ocean conditions dangerously unseaworthy. She was also, in the confined waters of Hampton Roads and the inshore coastal waters of the American eastern seaboard, exactly the right ship for the job. The Monitor's engagement with the Virginia on March 9, 1862, the first battle between armored warships, ended inconclusively in the tactical sense that neither vessel sank the other. But the strategic implication was clear. The era of the wooden warship was over, and the operational principle that the Monitor demonstrated, a heavily gunned, low freeboard vessel capable of operating in shallow coastal and riverine waters where conventional deep-draft warships could not go, would prove durable far beyond the specific circumstances of the Civil War. The Civil War produced dozens of Monitors of varying design, used primarily for the reduction of Confederate fortifications on the southern rivers and along the coast. They were slow, they were uncomfortable, and several of them were lost to the sea when they encountered open ocean conditions they had not been designed to handle. But their effectiveness against shore fortifications was genuine and documented, and the principle they demonstrated, that a vessel carrying heavy guns and drawing shallow water could suppress or destroy fixed defenses, remained a significant element of naval thinking through the last decades of the 19th century. By the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, the Monitor had largely disappeared from the active naval inventories of the major powers. The development of faster capital ships, the expansion of naval aviation, and the general strategic orientation of the major navies toward fleet action rather than coastal operations had made the slow, shallow-draft bombardment vessel seem like an anachronism. The Royal Navy had no monitors in active service in August of 1914. The situation that brought them back into existence was the specific character of the war on the Belgian coast, which by the autumn of 1914 had produced a strategic situation that neither the British nor the Germans had anticipated. The German advance through Belgium had been stopped before reaching the Channel ports of Dunkirk, Calais, and Boulogne, which remained in Allied hands and provided the supply lifeline for the British Expeditionary Force. The German forces, however, held the Belgian coast from roughly Nieuwpoort to the Dutch border, including the ports of Ostend and Zeebrugge, which were being developed as bases for German destroyers and submarines, threatening Allied shipping in the Channel and the southern North Sea. The Allied response to the German use of the Belgian ports required naval gunfire support along the coast, both to support the Allied forces holding the line at Nieuwpoort and Ypres and to suppress the German coastal installations and transportation infrastructure that supported the Flanders front. The problem was that the Belgian coast is shallow, with extensive sandbanks that made navigation by conventional deep-draft warships hazardous or impossible within effective gun range of the shore. The capital ships of the Grand Fleet drew too much water to operate in the coastal shallows. The cruisers and destroyers that could navigate more freely lacked the gun calibers required to destroy hardened German positions at long range. The solution that the Admiralty identified was the Monitor. In the autumn of 1914, it ordered the construction of a series of river monitors from British shipyards and simultaneously arranged for the purchase of 4 American river monitors that were already under construction for Brazil. The Brazilian vessels, converted for British use and commissioned into the Royal Navy, were the first of the new generation of British monitors. They were followed by the Humber class, the Abercrombie class, the General Wolfe class, and eventually the Lord Clive class, each successive design incorporating the lessons of the previous class's operational experience along the Belgian coast. The tactical environment in which these ships operated was defined by the geography of the Belgian coastline and by the specific character of German coastal defences. The Germans had established a series of heavy shore batteries along the coast, equipped with guns of 4.1-inch, 11-inch, 15-inch, and eventually 17-inch caliber, capable of engaging Allied vessels well beyond visual range, using rangefinders and observation posts on shore. The German batteries were protected by reinforced concrete emplacements that could withstand direct hits from most naval guns. The Monitor's role was not the delicate business of naval fire support for ground operations, but the blunter work of counter-battery fire against the German shore batteries, suppression of transportation targets behind the front lines, and periodic long-range bombardment of the port facilities at Ostend and Zeebrugge. This work required guns of the heaviest available calibers, because only the largest shells carried enough explosive to destroy or seriously damage the reinforced concrete shelters that protected the German batteries. The monitors that the Royal Navy operated in the early part of the war carried 12-inch and 14-inch guns taken from pre-dreadnought battleships that had been rendered obsolescent by the dreadnought revolution and stripped of their armament for reuse. These guns were adequate for many targets, but were not competitive with the heaviest German shore batteries, and the progressive German improvement of their coastal defences through 1915, 16, and 17 created the demand for guns of even greater caliber than the 12-inch and 14-inch weapons already in service. The answer was the 18-inch gun, and the ship built to carry it was the General Wolfe class Monitor, of which the Lord Clive was the second member. The decision to develop an 18-inch naval gun specifically for Monitor use was made by the Admiralty in 1915, and the design and development of the weapon was entrusted to the Coventry Ordnance Works and to Elswick. The gun that emerged, the 18-inch Mark I, was a weapon of extraordinary power and extraordinary size. Its barrel measured 21 meters in length. The complete gun assembly with its breech mechanism weighed approximately 150 tons. The shell it fired, weighing 1,536 kilograms, required a propellant charge of approximately 318 kilograms of cordite to achieve its design muzzle velocity. The entire loading cycle, from the time the breech was opened after firing to the time the next round was ready to fire, took approximately 4 minutes under favorable conditions with a trained crew. Only 2 of these guns were built. The first was mounted in HMS General Wolfe, the name ship of the class. The second was mounted in HMS Lord Clive. Both ships had been laid down in the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast and in the Palmer's Shipbuilding Company yard in Jarrow, respectively, as members of the Lord Clive class of monitors, completed in 1915 with 12-inch guns and then subsequently modified to carry the larger 18-inch weapon in a new mounting forward of the original position. The Lord Clive's physical characteristics reflected the specific requirements of the monitor mission. She measured 122 meters in length, with a beam of 27 meters that gave her the wide, stable hull form necessary for the accurate delivery of very heavy shell. Her draft of approximately 3.5 meters allowed her to operate in the shallow coastal waters of the Belgian coast, where conventional warships could not go. Her machinery was not designed for speed. 2 sets of triple expansion steam engines produced approximately 2,400 shaft horsepower and gave her a maximum speed of 6 knots, which was adequate for transit between anchorages and for the slow positioning adjustments required for accurate bombardment, but which gave her no capability for tactical maneuvering in any meaningful sense. The ship was protected against the threats she was most likely to encounter by a combination of measures that reflected the specific tactical situation of the Belgian coast. Her sides were protected by a system of anti-torpedo bulges, outboard structures filled with air and compartments that were intended to absorb the energy of a torpedo detonation before it reached the main hull. These bulges, which added substantially to the ship's beam and contributed to her distinctive, wide, squat appearance, were a feature of all the later Royal Navy monitors and reflected the recognition that the primary threat to these slow, unmaneuverable ships was not the German shore batteries, which could be countered to some degree by range, smoke, and the difficulty of ranging accurately on a low-profile target, but the German submarines and torpedo boats that operated from the Belgian ports. Her deck was protected against shell splinters, and her magazine and machinery spaces had localized armor protection, but she was not armored against the direct hits of heavy naval guns. The question of how to protect the monitors from the German shore batteries while allowing them to operate close enough to shore to engage their targets was one that the Royal Navy addressed through a combination of measures that illustrated both the ingenuity and the limitations of coastal bombardment operations. The monitors were typically accompanied by escort vessels that provided anti-submarine screening and could lay smoke screens to conceal the monitor's position from German shore observation. The firing positions were carefully chosen to place the monitors at maximum effective range from their targets, using the long-range capability of their heavy guns to engage while remaining outside or at the margins of the German battery's effective counter-fire range. Aerial observation from seaplanes and, later, from aircraft using the nascent techniques of air-ground communication was used to spot the fall of shot and correct the firing data. The fire control problem was one of the most technically demanding aspects of monitor operations. Engaging a target 30 kilometers inland with a gun whose projectile took approximately 90 seconds to complete its trajectory required corrections for the rotation of the Earth, which deflected shells fired in an easterly or westerly direction from their calculated path, for the variation in air density at different altitudes along the shell's trajectory, for the wear of the barrel, which increased slightly with each round fired, and which changed the muzzle velocity and therefore the range, and for the wind at various altitudes, which the fire control teams could only estimate from ground observations. The accumulated errors in these corrections meant that the first rounds of any bombardment were invariably inaccurate by margins that could be measured in hundreds of meters, and the process of walking the fire onto the target through successive corrections was slow and consumed significant ammunition. The 18-inch gun of HMS Lord Clive added further complications to the fire control problem. The barrel wear from a single round was approximately equivalent to the wear produced by 2 or 3 rounds from a 12-inch gun, reflecting the much greater propellant charge and the much greater forces involved in the firing cycle. The useful life of the barrel, measured in effective rounds fired, was therefore much shorter than the barrel life of smaller calibers. The limited number of rounds that could be fired before the barrel required replacement or relining constrained the tempo of operations in ways that commanders found frustrating. Each round fired from the 18-inch gun represented a significant expenditure of a resource that could not be quickly replenished. The ammunition itself posed storage and handling challenges that the ship's design had to accommodate. A shell weighing 1,536 kilograms could not be handled manually in any stage of its journey from the magazine to the breech. Mechanical hoists, rammers, and handling equipment were required throughout the loading cycle, and the reliability of this equipment under the vibration and heat of the firing cycle was a continuous maintenance concern. The magazine storage arrangements had to account for the explosive sensitivity of both the shells and the propellant charges, and had to provide adequate ventilation and temperature control to prevent deterioration of the propellant, which became progressively less stable as it aged. The operational record of HMS Lord Clive and HMS General Wolfe with their 18-inch guns was limited by the timing of their modification and the final phases of the war. The 18-inch gun mounting was installed in HMS General Wolfe in the spring of 1918 and in HMS Lord Clive somewhat later, giving them only a few months of operational service before the armistice in November. During that period, the two ships conducted a series of long-range bombardments against German coastal and rail targets in Belgium, and against the Bruges Canal system that connected the inland base at Bruges to the coast at Zeebrugge. The bombardment of the Bruges Canal and its associated infrastructure was one of the more sustained operations conducted by the 18-inch monitors. Bruges served as the main base for the German submarine and destroyer forces operating from the Flemish coast, connected to the sea by canals that ran to Zeebrugge and Ostend. The destruction of the canal locks, the railway lines, and the facilities at Bruges would have significantly degraded the German coastal forces' ability to operate, but the target was approximately 15 kilometers inland, and the physical destruction of hardened canal infrastructure required a precision and a weight of shell that even the 18-inch gun found difficult to deliver consistently against such specific targets. The famous Zeebrugge raid of April 23, 1918, which involved a direct assault by Royal Navy ships and Marines against the mole at Zeebrugge in an attempt to block the canal entrance, had been partly motivated by the recognized limitation of long-range bombardment to destroy the infrastructure it was designed to suppress. The raid itself was partially successful in military terms, blocking the canal with 2 old cruisers scuttled in the channel, and was a tactical achievement of considerable physical courage that produced 11 Victoria Crosses. But the canal was in operation again within days as the Germans dredged around the obstacles. The lesson was that bombardment and direct action could suppress and damage the Belgian coast installations, but could not permanently neutralize them without the ground forces necessary to occupy the territory. This lesson was not unique to the Belgian coast. It was a lesson that the entire history of naval bombardment of shore positions had been teaching since the age of sail. Naval gunfire could destroy, suppress, and demoralize, but it could not hold ground and could not permanently prevent the repair and reconstruction of facilities that remained in enemy hands. The Monitor embodied this lesson in physical form, a ship designed specifically for bombardment, optimized for nothing else, capable of delivering extraordinary destructive power to targets far inland, but incapable by itself of achieving the territorial control that would have made the destruction permanent. The Monitor's limitations in this regard were understood by the officers who operated them, and the operational records of the Belgian coast bombardment campaign reflect a continuous negotiation between what the ships could achieve and what was being asked of them. The Monitors were used most effectively when their fire was coordinated with ground operations that either exploited the disruption caused by bombardment or that fixed the German forces in place while the ship's fire neutralized specific high-value targets. The most productive operations were those in which the slow, methodical work of counter-battery fire, gradually silencing or suppressing the German shore batteries, allowed the Monitors to approach closer to shore and engage targets at shorter ranges with greater accuracy. The crew of HMS Lord Clive lived in a condition that was uncomfortable in ways that were different from, but comparable to the discomforts of the pre-dreadnought Monitor that had given the type its name half a century earlier. The wide, shallow hull that gave her stability for bombardment operations and the shallow draft that allowed her to operate in coastal waters made her an extremely poor sea boat in any kind of weather. The rolling and pitching motion of a wide, shallow vessel in open water was of a character that experienced sailors found deeply unpleasant and that inexperienced sailors found incapacitating. The North Sea and the Channel in the autumn and winter months generated sea conditions that regularly prevented the Monitors from operating and that on several occasions forced them to seek shelter in harbour. The accommodation for the crew of approximately 200 officers and men was not generous. The wide hull provided adequate deck area, but the shallow draft limited the depth of the spaces below the main deck, and the machinery spaces, magazine spaces, and ammunition handling arrangements consumed a disproportionate amount of the available internal volume. The men lived in an environment that smelled permanently of propellant, oil, and salt water, where the ventilation was inadequate, where the noise during firing operations was extreme even for men accustomed to naval gunfire, and where the motion in any kind of sea was difficult for all but the most seasoned sailors. The firing of the 18-inch gun was an experience that impressed itself permanently on everyone present. Contemporary accounts describe the pressure wave from the muzzle blast as physically painful at any position on the deck, the smoke cloud as sufficient to obscure the ship entirely for several seconds after firing, and the structural vibration transmitted through the hull as severe enough to knock loose fittings from their mounts and to require protective measures for equipment sensitive to shock. The crew members whose duty required them to be on the upper deck during firing wore ear protection of the period, which was rudimentary by comparison to modern standards, and suffered the accumulated hearing damage that was the characteristic occupational consequence of serving in heavy gunnery ships throughout the naval history of the age of the gun. The post-war fate of HMS Lord Clive and the Monitor class generally followed the pattern of all the specialized warships that the First World War had produced in response to specific tactical situations that the end of the war rendered less urgent. The Monitors were placed in reserve, maintained at reduced levels of operational readiness, and eventually assessed for the usefulness they might have in a future conflict. The conclusion reached by the post-war Royal Navy was that Monitors retained a potentially useful role in the support of future amphibious operations and coastal campaigns, but that the maintenance of a large fleet of specialized bombardment vessels was not justified by the peacetime budget available to the Royal Navy in the 1920s and 30s. HMS Lord Clive was sold for scrapping in 1927. HMS General Wolfe was sold for scrapping in the same year. The two 18-inch guns they had carried, the most powerful guns ever mounted on a British warship, had between them fired a total of approximately 24 rounds in operational service, a figure that reflects both the limited time available for their operational use and the careful husbanding of barrel life that the limited service life of 18-inch barrels required. The technical achievement of the guns themselves, the engineering of a weapon of that caliber and that projectile weight, was substantial and genuine. But the operational record they accumulated before the armistice ended the campaign was too thin to provide the basis for a thorough assessment of the type's effectiveness. The monitor concept was not entirely abandoned in the Second World War. The Royal Navy maintained a small number of monitors through the interwar period and brought new ones into service during the Second World War, including the Erebus and Terror class and the new construction Roberts class. These Second World War monitors carried 15-inch guns taken from battleships that had been withdrawn from service, and they were used in the bombardment role during the operations in the Mediterranean, in support of the Normandy landings, and in other amphibious operations where shore-fire support was required. The Roberts-class monitors, in particular, provided effective fire support during Operation Overlord and subsequent operations along the French and Belgian coasts, a return to the operational environment where the monitor type had established its utility in the First World War. The evolution of naval fire support in the post-war period eventually made the specialized monitor obsolete in a more permanent way. The development of naval aviation, and specifically of carrier-based aircraft capable of delivering precise ordnance to targets far inland, provided a fire support capability that was in most respects superior to the very long-range naval gun, more flexible, more rapidly redeployable, and not dependent on the specific geographic conditions that made monitor operations practical. The guided missile, both surface-launched and air-launched, further displaced the heavy naval gun as the preferred instrument of long-range bombardment. Modern warships carry guns of 5-inch caliber where their predecessors of the monitor age carried 18-inch weapons because the precision of modern fire control and the effectiveness of modern munitions make the 5-inch shell precisely delivered more effective against most targets than the 18-inch shell, area delivered, of 1918. The lineage from the original USS Monitor of 1862 to HMS Lord Clive of 1918 is traceable and direct. The Civil War monitors established the operational concept, a heavily armed shallow-draft vessel for coastal bombardment operations in waters where conventional warships could not operate. The First World War monitors refined and scaled that concept, building vessels specifically designed for the extended coastal campaigns that the static nature of the Western Front required, and fitting them with progressively heavier guns as the demand for destructive power against hardened targets increased. The 18-inch gun monitor represented the logical endpoint of this scaling process, the largest gun that could be practically mounted on any ship that could still be described as a monitor rather than as a fixed battery. There is a kind of mechanical purity to the Lord Clive's design that is not immediately apparent from a description of her tactical limitations. She was, in the most direct sense possible, a gun and a ship. The gun existed to fire shells at targets that other guns could not reach. The ship existed to carry the gun to positions where it could do so. Every other characteristic of the design, the shallow draft, the wide beam, the slow speed, the anti-torpedo bulges, the magazine arrangements, the fire control systems, was subordinated to the requirements of the gun and its employment. There was no compromise toward speed or maneuverability or general-purpose utility of the kind that characterized the design of destroyers and cruisers, vessels that were trying to do multiple things simultaneously. The Lord Clive was trying to do one thing: put an 18-inch shell on a target 30 kilometers inland. That singularity of purpose, and the extraordinary physical scale of the weapon that gave it effect, made the Lord Clive and her sister ship, the General Wolfe, unique, not merely in their own era, but in the entire history of naval armament. No warship before or since has fired a gun of 18-inch caliber in operational service from a Royal Navy ship. The two 18-inch guns built for the General Wolfe class represent the highest point on the graph of British naval gun caliber, a point that was reached in the specific circumstances of the Belgian coast campaign in the last year of the First World War, and that has never been approached since. The gun itself, the Mark I 18-inch, exists today only in the historical record. The two guns were removed from the ships when they were sold for scrapping, and were themselves subsequently broken down for metal. The engineering knowledge that produced them has been preserved in the technical documents of the Naval Ordnance Establishment and in the records of the Coventry Ordnance Works. The shells they fired, some of which presumably remain unexploded in the fields and waterways of Belgium where the shot fell, may still occasionally be discovered by the farmers and construction workers of Flanders, where the physical residue of the First World War continues to surface from the disturbed earth more than a century after the war that produced it ended. HMS Lord Clive is gone. Her gun is gone. The coast she bombarded has been rebuilt, the canal she targeted has continued to function, and the German installations she sought to destroy were rendered obsolete by the same armistice that ended her operational career. What remains is the specific historical fact of what she was. The largest gun ever carried by a Royal Navy warship, on the strangest platform ever devised for its carriage, in the service of a tactical requirement that the static warfare of the Belgian coast had made urgent and that the end of that warfare made permanently unnecessary. She was a raft with a gun. She was also, in the specific circumstances of her time and place, precisely the right answer to a problem that no other ship could have addressed.